So I'd like to talk a little bit about the chapter on credit for and the gender issues regarding credit. Uh, and the overall economic environment of poor people in most developing countries is not people working in factories. So when we think about the Industrial Revolution in the 1850s in Europe, we think of working people, the proletariat, slaving away in their machines. But the reality of life for most people in developing countries is that they are self-employed in what's often called an informal economy, where they are paying very limited taxes, where they have very limited engagement with the state. And they're in single person or small group activities using their own working capital. And this might be a rickshaw driver, a person making rice and sauce in the marketplace and selling it, maybe making baskets all day long, other kinds of handicrafts, a photographer who takes portraits for special occasions or everyday life. So there's a thousand and one different kinds of informal occupations that people engage in, sometimes refer to them as micro entrepreneurs or as small enterprises that employ two or three people, often family members, in the activity. Now, in this economic environment, it makes sense to think about a question that maybe increases in the working capital that these micro entrepreneurs have would enable them to have greater net revenue. Net revenue, of course, are their profits. Excuse me, camera just cut out. So people might have more variety if they are small retailers and traders. They might have larger pots if they're cooking for their livelihood and selling foodstuffs, prepared foodstuffs in the marketplace. So a big pot is going to enable them to produce and sell a lot more in the marketplace than a small pot. A big pot costs more. A big pot requires more firewood or charcoal in order to cook. And so that requires greater working capital to purchase the firewood or the charcoal in order to cook and other kinds of ingredients. More working capital might enable a micro entrepreneur to hire an assistant. So these are the kinds of issues that are relevant when thinking about this informal economy that is maybe 70% of all the people in developing countries. Now, if working capital is so important and so profitable, we might say, well, why don't people just save up to have greater working capital? Why don't they postpone consumption? And then they'll eventually have more working capital, and that'll lead to higher net revenue and then higher incomes. There's a number of reasons why we might think that these micro entrepreneurs in these poor economies might find it quite hard to save. Their incomes, by the virtue of being micro entrepreneurs, their incomes are quite uncertain. They have a lot of demand shocks, a lot of production shocks. Their bodies themselves are inputs into the production process. So whenever they get sick, production grinds to a halt and they need to consume to sustain their own bodies during that time period. There's also very high costs of saving, in the sense that uh, saving a nickel a day, if your income that you're earning is $1 a day, a nickel a day is 5% of your income. But you can't really go to a bank and deposit a nickel a day. This might be the bank itself might charge more than a nickel a day to have a savings account in the bank. The bank might be far away, so you'd have to travel to the bank, which would cost more than a nickel a day. So we see all kinds of reasons why micro savings might be very hard. And finally, of course, a poor person faces many temptations. The quality of life of a poor person is is poor. And so a poor person, in order to attain some sense of dignity and worth in their own life, is constantly being tempted to buy a cigarette to indicate that you're a responsible member of society by standing and smoking a cigarette at the end of the day, by buying some, right, in Jane Austen novels, the women are often at the ribbon shop. So buying a little bit fancier clothing might be the way a woman might make a statement that she's a member of her community who has a certain level of dignity and self-worth. So these temptations, rather than saving all the time, might be very human uh, impediments, human psychological impediments to saving a lot. So uh, in this context, then, a loan might perhaps help. And so we might ask, well, why don't poor people just borrow then, increase their working capital, and thus get richer? And it seems like for the same reasons that savings is hard, lending to poor people is hard because there's not so much assurance of repayment. So into that gap comes microfinance institutions to resolve some of these problems. And microfinance institutions emerged in the 1980s, 1990s, with a whole set of innovations in finance, including group liability. So the microfinance institution is worried that an individual might not repay. So instead of lending to an individual, the microfinance institution lends to a group of individuals and says, if any one of you do not repay, the others are responsible for paying for that individual. So that's like a co-signer on a loan. These microfinance institutions also use the group mechanism to leverage peer monitoring. So the banking organization has a hard time knowing what you're actually doing with the money that it has loaned you. Are you actually investing it so that you'll be able to repay the loan? So peer monitoring is a way of facilitating that assurance that the money is going in to repayment of the loan, because of course, if there is um, if there's group liability, then as a peer, you want to monitor your fellow peers who you're jointly liable for to make sure that they actually devote the funds to that activity. And this, of course, then leads to peer pressure, that the joint liability means that your peers are going to be pressuring you, perhaps using the kind of informal pressure only available at that micro scale that the bank cannot use. So they'll pressure you to borrow the loan. Moreover, your joint peers might use screening. That is, they might say, well, you're a known person who's, a spendthrift. You don't actually want to get richer. You prefer to, smoke a lot of cigarettes and drink a lot of beer on the weekends, or you're an idle woman. You're not a good risk. And so we're not going to let you join our joint liability group in the first place. So the local entrepreneurs screen out the poor credit risks. These same people, of course, part of peer pressure is to apply sanctions, and in particular to apply social sanctions. One can easily imagine the co-signers of this joint liability, this group liability loan, saying, well, you wasted the money and you didn't repay, and now we're all liable. So you know what? You're not going to be invited to the social functions of our village, of our community anymore. In places where law enforcement is all local, that is, there's very little law enforcement other than what members of a village can enforce amongst themselves, it's very hard for any kind of judicial system to confiscate any assets of a person who hasn't repaid, but it might be much easier for the local chief or local informal political organization to say, you didn't repay your loan, we're taking your bicycle and selling it, and that's how you're going to repay the loan. So these are some of the mechanisms that microfinance institutions used. They also use other kinds of behavioral techniques rather than having, here's your loan, come back next year and repay it. They had intensive repayment schedules, often involving repayment every week. They often targeted women for repayment, and so would have microfinance schemes only for women, with the idea that all of these psychological behavioral mechanisms would apply with even greater force to women who may be less mobile, less willing to defy their fellow joint borrowers, and other reasons. The women might be more concerned with their reputational consequences of non-repayment. Finally, microfinance institutions were maybe more credible than other kinds of finance institutions in that this was their mission to lend to poor people. And so they were more likely to be around in future years. So partly your incentives to repay these loans depend on what you think the likelihood is that this place will be around to give you a loan in the future. If you think that banking institutions, they're coming out and doing this program in this village, but they've never been seen before, that we'll never see them again, then your incentives to repay are very small, because you figure, well, they're going to experiment with making loans to us, but then they'll leave. So we'll move on to evaluation of these microfinance programs in a second. I'm going to in the next recording.